And welcome everybody to the next podcast. We are joined by Paula Brady, our Chief Operating Officer for NI and Republic of Ireland, isn't it? Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland.
Yeah.
And then today we're going to be talking about legislation, how to keep up to date, what you should be doing to manage it, and all the other things around it. I suppose focusing on 14,001, isn't it? ISO 14,001 and 45 mostly, but obviously it does impact general legislation as well related to your business. So there we go. So Paula, do we need to introduce yourself as you've been on it before? I suppose give a little bit of a rundown, I suppose.
Yeah. As Mike had said, I'm CEO of Ireland, sort of Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, managing the client base and out doing audits quite a bit as well. So keeping my ear to the ground and knowing what's going on out there. So legislation forms a huge part of that, especially when most companies go for all three standards. So not just quality, but their health, safety and environmental as well.
I think quite a few people struggle with the legislation part, don't they, really, I think?
I think it's a bit of an enigma. They're like, yeah, they see it in the standards and it's a clause there and they go, oh yeah, but we're compliant with everything we need to be, without really giving it the time and energy that it needs, because there's such a raft of legislation out there, and it's about understanding what's applicable to you and then how you go about making sure you're compliant to it. And I'm sure you've come across this too, that most companies, so health and safety legislation is much more well known than maybe environmental legislation is. So you get that a lot of companies will already be compliant with quite a bit of their health and safety requirements, and not so much, I always say, the ones who have went for 14,001 get a bit of a shock because they're suddenly made aware of all of this environmental legislation that maybe they didn't know of before, yet standards or not standards, you're supposed to be compliant with it. And I think it's getting that through to quite a few of the companies is the difficult thing, that even if they didn't go for their ISO standards, these things are still a requirement for your business.
That is true. That is true, actually, because whether you're getting certified to ISO 14 or 45 or any standard, really, you've still got to be legally compliant, haven't you? You can still be prosecuted. Yeah, that's a good point.
Absolutely. I think it's probably the oversight for environmental legislation isn't quite there the way it is for health and safety, in the fact that your government bodies, your health and safety executive, have quite an enforcement or a resource there to go out to businesses to check in that they are being compliant. And the Environment Agency probably doesn't have quite the same level of resource to do that. They tend to only get involved when there's a complaint made or something is very evident. So I think that has put it sort of into the shadows a little bit, and the companies aren't aware as much. So it is the one that I would get asked most about when we're out doing the audits and we're looking for the evidence to show that a company's compliant. Honestly, companies just had no awareness at all that in and around waste legislation in particular, there's quite a requirement there of the documentation you should hold, how long you have to hold it for, and sort of how you check that the suppliers that you're using are licensed to do what you're asking them to do.
So why do you think they're not as highly regulated? Do you think it's because health and safety is more related to people can die, people's health and things like that, and environmental people tend not to die, I suppose?
Well, it depends too, but yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. There's a much more awareness, health and safety legislation, prosecutions. If there's a death in a business or something caused by an accident, there's quite a public awareness in around that. And so probably health and safety executives have a bigger remit to ensure compliance. They have a bigger enforcement team who are sort of set out to go and visit businesses to make them aware of their legal responsibilities and to check that they're sort of meeting those. Environmentally, my guess is it's probably going to grow. So the environment is sort of the next big thing. It's what more and more businesses are being asked to demonstrate their compliance to, and that they're committed to sort of protecting the environment and preventing pollution, which are the two big statements in your environmental policy. So yeah, I can see it becoming more so.
yeah, we do. There's not many clients we get quotes for now that only want 9001, does it? They're generally always 9 and 14. Yeah, it probably is because of that ESG and sustainability and environmental concerns coming out. I imagine
It
that's a big factor in it.
absolutely is. It's kind of the first step for a lot of businesses now to demonstrate that ESG commitment, that they're aware of, the sort of what's going on out there, and that they have to now put their money where their mouth is, and then show kind of that they're making steps to be more environmentally friendly, to have considered their impact on the environment. And 2001 is kind of one of the best initial steps to do that. In fact, companies are now searching for additional standards that sit in and around that sustainability piece, like energy management and business continuity. And there's quite a bit going on out there. But when I get asked that, I said, look, your 14,001 should be your main tool to demonstrate that you have identified where you might impact the environment and you're controlling it. And a lot of that control is based in and around legislations and then that compliance check. So if we go back to the black and white of the standard, it sort of says organisations should be aware of its compliance obligations. And that's across the board. That can be legislation, but it can also be if you have membership of professional bodies or your ISO standards. That's sort of, what do I need to comply with as a business operating in the industry I'm operating in? The second step is the most critical. Be aware of it, but then demonstrate how you are compliant to what's relevant. And that's where a lot of businesses get confused, or not confused, aren't aware of what it takes to demonstrate that compliance. So they'll just say, yeah, we're compliant. Great. But how do you know you're compliant? What have you looked at to demonstrate? So it's nearly like an internal audit. In fact, if you do a really good compliance check, you have most of your internal audit done on an operational sense, in the
Do you
fact
think
that
that's
you're checking.
do you think that's because they're not aware of the legislation fully and what's required, or is it a bit naivety on what's needed, or why is that? Why are people like, oh yeah, we're compliant, but they don't demonstrate it? Why do you think that is?
I think it's, yeah, a lack of understanding of the bones of the legislation and the fact that they need to have proper evidence on these things to demonstrate compliance. Because worst case scenario in health and safety or environmental, if you've broken the law, if you're not compliant and have caused an issue, you're going to get prosecuted for it. There's a story from a client from years back, and it sort of goes back to that environmental and agency and not having the oversight. They had a complaint from a neighbour, and because they were burning rubbish on a Saturday afternoon. Their yard man was. They weren't aware of it at the time.
That's all right. It's Saturday. Well,
It's fine.
it's outside of
So
work hours.
this smoke had annoyed a neighbour, and the neighbour had called the Environment Agency. But they'd come in, and actually, when they come into the business, the Environment Agency done quite a thorough check and found a number of areas in which the business were breaching legislation. Now, they were doing a great thing. They were actually donating windows and doors to charity, but they weren't allowed to do it because you weren't allowed to store the waste at an area that it wasn't created, and you weren't allowed to hand over what was that designated as waste to another organisation. And they prosecuted them for it.
Really?
So,
Why? Because they weren't registered as a waste transfer station, basically.
yeah, and it's slightly, the laws in Northern Ireland are slightly different to England in the fact that you're not allowed to hold any waste if it in it somewhere where it hasn't been produced. So I think in England there's a bit of a leeway. There's a certain tonnage amount that you're allowed
Yeah.
to bring back and hold until it's disposed of legally. Here there's not, and that's what they applied. And the fact that as soon as those doors and windows were removed from the place where they had been installed, they were designated as waste. So the company had a waste carrier's license, which was fine, but they came back and held them until they had enough to donate to a charity. It was an illegal movement of waste.
Like you say, they're doing a good thing and really not putting it into the waste stream, putting it into the ground or burning it.
Exactly, doing a good thing.
Doing a good thing and got themselves in trouble. Right, that's interesting.
It's not the
Okay,
only
yeah.
story that I have like that, but that's where you need to be aware of what those laws actually say and what you're allowed and not allowed to do. There's things like exemptions to waste management licensing in Northern Ireland in particular, that they're called simple exemptions, where you are doing things like that. You just apply to the Environment Agency and ask for a simple exemption to hold that waste until you have sufficient quantities to allow the movement. But it's being aware of that. And we find quite a lot of organisations aren't aware of it. And you kind of say, is it because of the resources there? But, the same goes for your health and safety. Being really clued up on what's required takes a bit of work.
So how does someone go about identifying the legislation then that's applicable to them?
Yeah, that's a $1 million question, Mike, that one.
Obviously, it's different, I suppose, because it's probably slightly different over there than it is over here. And there's OSHA in America. Theirs is slightly different over there.
It's it's straightforward enough. The government have their legislation websites, and you can go on. They're all quite searchable. HSE are a really good resource. HSE and I actually have a legislation tab on their website, and that will list all the relevant health and safety legislations to a variety of industries, both primary and subordinate legislations that you can go and check, and they keep those updated obviously as there's any changes, which is a good resource. We're very fortunate in Northern Ireland. We still have a website called NetRegs that operates now. It's UK wide, but Northern Irish and Scottish legislation are the only two that are still live on it.
It was a nightmare when they stopped doing that for England. It was a brilliant resource, great tool.
Amazing tool.
I can't believe they got rid of it, to be honest. Well, got rid of it over here. It's criminal.
I can't believe it. It seemed like quite a simple thing to keep running, and especially as Northern Irish and Scottish legislation remains up and live on it. It's my go-to source. I actually subscribe to email that comes in monthly that informs you of any upcoming legislation changes and anything that has just come into play or is about to come into play. And it'll actually give you the breakdown of who it's relevant to and what sort of changes have been made, if there's amendments, which, that's the difficult thing. Legislation is tricky in the amendments and updates and changes and whether it's applicable to what you do and whether it's not. So
stick with construction. If I've got a construction company though, so I go to NetRegs or HSE website, how do I sift through to identify what's actually applicable? Because there's reams and reams and reams of legislation. How do I know what ones are applicable to my business and what ones I can ignore?
Yeah, those actual websites have really good search fields in them, and you can say, and a lot of help topics. So you can put in construction industry on the HSE website, and it will give you sort of a whole synopsis of the relevant kind of areas, and then the legislation's broke down within those. So with a wee bit of research, you can do that. NetRegs absolutely still does for all industries. You can put in your industry type, and it'll give you sort of a whole set of guidances relevant to your industry and give you suggestions and kind of prompt you to ask questions of, what do I do as a business? What could potentially impact the environment? And are there legislations in and around this? So, do we store chemicals? Do we sell chemicals? Do we have waste streams? Do we have hazardous waste streams? But even that, organisations knowing what's a hazardous waste and what's just a controlled waste can be quite tough.
Yeah, so we haven't got NetRegs here, so the environmental bit is quite tricky. And
okay.
we have, it's basically
you still
stopped
had it as a resource, just not the legislation.
We got it, but it's not very helpful. So we get a lot of clients that will say, well, how do I go about finding it? HSE is easy, go on the HSE website. Environmental's a lot trickier, and it takes a lot more time to sift through everything and identify what's applicable to you.
Really, is it just for England and Wales? Is it just going through the government legislation side?
Unfortunately, a lot of it is, and it can be a challenge. So if you don't know what you're looking at, it takes a lot of research, really, Googling it.
Reading legislation is the task in itself, and sort of getting to the point, which is why a lot of those websites are really good, because they sort of break it down and give you the headlines, if you like, on what the changes and updates are. But it can be tricky, which is why there's quite a few paid for services out there as well that will offer legislative updates. And I see quite a few clients moving down that route whenever they're really needing a wee bit more help than just spending hours trawling through reams of legislation. That's kind of part of what our job, which is easier, but not necessarily a business.
Yeah, I suppose if you're a fairly low risk company like an office, you might just use the government websites because the legislation is not going to be massive. If you're sort of a big construction company or doing lots of waste or, big
Absolutely.
manufacturing, burning things, then yeah, you might want to sign up to one of those services. Yeah, might make your life easier.
Absolutely. But I think a lot of companies run into the issue of just listing absolutely everything. They'll just
Yeah.
literally every environmental legislation they can come up with and every health and safety or other requirement, and not all of them will be relevant. Some of them are good for information purposes, but I think if you start to build a list of 100 or 200 legislations, it becomes a job in itself to do a compliance check because maybe 50% of those aren't relevant to what you do as an organisation. I think that's something to be worked on by a
So
lot
how
of
do I
clients.
So if I've gone off and found the legislation that is applicable to me, I get rid of the stuff that's not applicable. What do I do with it then? Do I put it on a register? How do I manage it then?
So we see most companies putting it on a register because it's one of the simpler ways to kind of say, okay, I'm very much aware of what's relevant to me. Here's a list of them. And they'll usually sort of break it down into what the legislation is about and then compliance criteria. So, yeah, this is what it's about. This is what we should have in place to show that we're compliant. And then that final step, which isn't always there, is, and this is the evidence we checked within our own business to say, yeah, we're happy that we comply with those requirements. But it is nearly that, 3 to 4 stage process. What's the legislation? Is it the most up-to-date version that I have? What is it about? How does it apply to me and what should I have in place? And then do I have it in place?
Yeah, because I think some
So,
people do like generic things, don't they? And say this is what the legislation is. They don't really say. I think you need to put it in layman's terms, really, because people reading it, your office staff, they look at it like it means nothing. I think it's important to put the specific of what your organisation needs to do to comply. I think it's quite important.
yeah, nearly like a little checklist to say, okay, when it's the duty of care controlled waste regulations, what does that mean? What does that mean for me? And it really is mapping out your waste streams, being aware of them, being aware of what our legal responsibility is, and then what documentation we should have in place to demonstrate that we're compliant. So you're talking your waste transfer notes and your season tickets, the licenses of your waste contractors for carrying it and for managing that waste. It's the checklist nearly writes itself when you understand the requirements of what that legislation is. The waste regs have specific information that needs to be on your waste transfer documentation, and that's another yearly checklist to know that you have to put in there your European waste catalogue codes, your standard industry classification codes, a description of the waste, where it's being picked up from, who's carrying it, where it's going, what signatures are required to be on there. So it takes
Yeah,
it
so
takes
you
a little bit of work.
almost did like little bullet points on it, just to say these are the bits you need on it. Yeah, because
Yeah,
quite often when we're looking at waste transfer notes, there's bits missing, aren't there? Let's be fair. Someone's
always
not signed it, the hierarchy's not there, EWC's not there. There's always something like that. I think
nine
waste
times out of 10.
companies don't make our lives very easy, do they? Because I think they're in, collect the bin or waste and then just leave. And yeah,
Yeah. And
the
they're aware of
paperwork.
the requirement, but I think what a lot of businesses miss is that it's actually their responsibility to make sure the paperwork's right. So you employ a waste contractor and they think that's it. Like they know what they're doing. They assume that the paperwork's fine and they never check it. So when we come in as auditors and we go, can we see that waste documentation? And we look down through it for that compliance check that we do as part of our audit. And you go, oh no, actually these aren't right. And we get a lot of shock. I'm sure you have had that too, where they're going, what do you mean they're not right? You know, uh, you have to explain, no, as producer of the waste, it's actually your documentation. The contractors supply it as a service, but it's not their responsibility to check and make sure it's right. That's yours. Because if that waste goes astray and ends up somewhere it shouldn't be, you're the one prosecuted, not your waste contractor. So,
Yeah, which I understand, but also find it a little bit confusing. Not confusing. So I understand, yeah, you're responsible, but you can't just say, I collected the waste I've got no responsibility. Surely
Mm.
there's the waste carriers and things like that. They've got a duty as well on that, surely.
They have a duty, but I don't think it really sets it out fully in the legislation that when it comes down to it, it's the producer of the waste has the ultimate responsibility. Much like on a building site, it's the principal contractor has a responsibility, even if it's a subcontractor who comes on site and it's his man or somebody gets hurt or there's a breach sort of down the chain. The ultimate responsibility comes back up to principal contractor and their insurances. I think it's pretty much that. There might be some liability on your contractor, but not fully. We did, previous business I worked for, we had an instance where we had a waste contractor come in. We had been very clear in what we wanted from the waste contractor. They were taking off topsoil and bringing it to a local council facility that we believed on that contract there was a government oversight or from a fraud perspective thing. But he actually followed that oversight, followed the waste contractor to a farmer's field and seen him tipping into a farmer's field on unlicensed waste transfer or, illegal waste transfer. And he brought it to the attention of the Environment Agency. Now, as principal contractor, because we had 14,001, because we had a contract signed up with the waste contractor that specified where they were supposed to take it and their documentation said that they were taking it to where we believed it was, they left us out of that prosecution.
Okay.
And it
You'd
went
kind of
on to
done
the waste
everything.
contract.
You'd done everything you had to do. Paperwork was there. They just were being fraudulent, basically.
Yeah. But if we hadn't have been checking the paperwork and, it hadn't given in disposal site, we would have been liable. Now, that did beg the question about when do you have to follow your waste contractors to make sure they're taking it to where they're saying they're taking it? And it's probably something I have a discussion with clients with quite a bit. And I say only if you're suspicious that they're not taking it to where they say they are. If you know the site's half an hour away and they're back in 20 minutes, they haven't went to where they're supposed to, then you have an obligation randomly to have followed to make sure. But what building contractor or what company is going to follow their waste contractor vehicles back? It's a tough one.
Interesting. So what? Here's one that I think catches some people out. When the council take their waste, so if it's an office, the council take their waste, do they need to have records for that?
They do, yeah, and it is one that catches people out. So all councils are sort of very aware of this and they will issue season tickets for collection of commercial waste. Now that's if you're a registered business, and there's a fee to actually get in. In Northern Ireland there certainly is. There's a fee for commercial waste collection from your councils. And so they are duty bound to supply you with usually a season ticket. So a season ticket is like a waste transfer note, but it lasts for a period of up to 12 months, up to and not over 12 months. So you will find a lot of councils issuing those to the organisations that they collect from. And it means that you don't have to have an individual note for every weekly collection of, say, your recycling bin or your general waste bin. And that documentation suffices from a legal perspective to show that you have a contract in place with somebody who's licensed to take your waste, and these are the waste types that they're taking. And they'll usually give you one for each separate waste stream. But you're right, not many people ask for it.
Yeah, I've caught a few clients on that. Yeah, where they just assume, well, it's the council. Of course, they're doing it right. You've still got, like you say, a duty of care and an obligation to get that paperwork and have it in place.
Yeah. We laugh because we actually, for one of the local councils, we do a few departments, and the council itself lifts some of the waste from one of the departments. So that was difficult to get through to them. They still needed a season ticket from inside their own organisation for their general waste streams, even though it was on the same site that they kind of lifted from. So yeah, you can get awkward ones like that, but it's certainly interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So we've identified the legislation that's applicable to us. We've kind of put it onto a register, you say. We kind of identify what's required in it, in the legislation. And then the last bit what was it? Evaluation of compliance, was it? You said?
Evaluation of compliance, which is a clause all in its own right of both environmental and health and safety standard. So yeah, be aware of it, but then demonstrate, check, verify your compliance status, because that's actually where you can catch things before they become an issue. So if you are, for example, under LOLR, looking at your lifting operations and lifting equipment, you have done a thorough compliance check on the statutory inspections, for example, that you get done, and realise that you've either missed equipment or there's been significant defect and so the stuff isn't appropriate for what you're doing, then you've kind of caught your breach before it becomes an issue or before someone else, like the health and safety executive come in and realise that there's an issue there and a breach. So that self-check becomes really vital to making sure, one, that your equipment and policies, processes, risk assessments are correct and keeping your people safe and healthy, but also preventing that sort of breach of legislation and prosecution or improvement notices from your health and safety executive. Same goes for your environmental. If you are doing that check really thoroughly, you're identifying your issue before it becomes an issue. And it goes back to your risk management of your standards, that kind of initial clauses, what are your internal, external issues, which legislation or compliance is one of them. And it follows through that process. Okay, is this a risk for us? Yes, it is. What do we have in place? Well, we have a legislation register and we check our compliance on a regular basis, mitigating the risk, meaning that we're going to be dealing with an issue further down the line.
So they have to record this? Is that a requirement that they record these checks?
They have to record the status of compliance. So it's a bit of a grey area in the standard in the fact that you have to record the results of your compliance check. So
Right.
Yes, we're compliant. No, we're not compliant. It doesn't specify how exactly that process goes. There's guidance on it, but the actual black and white of the standard says that what has to be recorded is the result of the compliance check.
So there's a bit of a get out there. But I suppose if
Little
we
bit.
go in and find things wrong, bits of legislation they're not compliant with, we can then say that process isn't working, obviously.
It's not.
Your simple yes and no needs a bit more meat on the bones.
And that tends to be where it's at with a lot of clients. They've said yes or no, but an external auditor comes in, we check the evidence because it's part of the process of what we have to do, and say, well, actually, there's issues here. So your compliance check process isn't being effective to prevent this. And yeah, you're right. Then we can raise an issue on the process. But if we check, if all they say is yes or no, yes, we're compliant, no, we're not, and that process has been, we find nothing in our audit, you can't raise anything, but you can sort of say to them, it might be beneficial to look at it this way and to record the evidence that you're using to determine your compliance status, because that's a good tool to look back on. So when you come to do your next compliance check, you can look back at your previous one and see what was checked and do a similar process, obviously taking a different sample.
Yeah, so you don't need to check them all every year then, you're saying. You can just do a couple each year, is it? Or
It depends how well controlled they are, but personally, I think it's good practice to all your critical legislations that you need to be compliant to do a regular check on them, be that 6 monthly or annually. At least take that objective evidence and verify it sort of frequently enough. Some companies do go down the other way and they'll take 2 or 3 pieces of legislation on an annual basis and just verify compliance. But then for everything else that's relevant, how do you justify that statement of compliance?
I suppose it's a risk,
difficult.
isn't it? It's a big risk.
It's a risk, and if you went by you're not recording a result of compliance against all relevant legislation if you're only picking 1 or 2 a year.
Okay, so here's one for you. They're paying us to go in and do an audit. Why can't they use our audit? I've had that before. Well, that's what I'm paying you to do their evaluation.
All that we're supposed to be doing is checking that they have a good process in place to verify that they're compliant with legislation. So really and truly, we should just be checking the process, but we will do our own compliance check to check the process, if that makes sense. It's a bit of a double up on that, but so they can't really rely on us because that's not what the standard says they need to be doing. They should be doing their own internal audit. They should be making themselves aware of and up to date on all relevant legislations and amendments, and they should be doing their own compliance check. If we
Yeah.
can help out by raising something, great. But
Yeah. I've had it before, and I think trying to remember what the document is. There's an EA document. I think it's 07/4. If I'm geeking off a bit, that actually says it's the client's legal obligation. It's not ours. We're there, like you say, to do a management system check, and we'll have a brief look at some of the legislation, obviously, make sure they're compliant. But yeah, it's their responsibility at the end of the day. It's not ours.
yeah,
We're just doing a
absolutely
sample.
not. What we do is that's the other thing. In audits, you're only ever taking a sample, but a full out compliance check shouldn't just be a sample, which comes back to that 1 or 2 legislations a year. Doesn't really cut it. It should be a statement of compliant with everything that I'm required to be compliant to. And you need the evidence back up to sort of confirm that. Otherwise, you're making a guess. You're taking on risk. And, it's not necessarily a good thing for a business to take on that level of risk, because it is the one thing that you've missed that may cause accident, injury, or pollution incident. And then you're into a whole different level of thing where suddenly it's, one, you've either hurt somebody by not sort of keeping and maintaining your management systems, you haven't provided a safe place of work, or you haven't protected the environment. And then that also has an impact on reputation and public perception.
So either way, I'm going to get prosecuted, really, or I can get prosecuted, I should say.
Yeah, it's a risk. And some companies aren't aware of the full requirements of each legislation. I had a client too who, on forklift inspections, so a statutory annual inspection is required for forklift trucks. They had a 6 monthly maintenance contract in place. So they believed they were doing over and above what the requirement was, but it was a maintenance contract. It wasn't a statutory inspection. So they actually were fully in breach of the legislation, having believed that they were sort of doing best in class. So
I've had that actually when someone was getting their emergency systems tested or checked under a service contract. They assumed the emergency lighting was being done, but it wasn't. So I think it's important knowing what's got to be done and making sure your contracts, if you are outsourcing some of those things, which you will in most cases, making sure that actually those contracts do what they've got to do, meet the legislation.
absolutely. The easiest way to do that is to sample your evidence and check, read your inspections. The other great one is sort of we've covered this under non-conformances, but defect reports on your statutory inspections. So if defects have been raised, you legally have to do something about them. If they're category A, actually the inspection body is required to inform the health and safety executive. So if they're unsafe for use, they're sort of duty bound to inform the HSE that they have failed a piece of, equipment, and then you have to do something about it before you put it back into operation. A category B defect is one that has to be done usually within either 1 to 3 months, 1 month, 3 months. It'll specify on your statutory inspection. And then there are recommendations, and those are safety recommendations. While they don't sort of carry the same time frame constraints, they should be considered by the company as something that needs done. And you'll see things like seat belts and tire wear and tear and horns and sort of a lot of safety equipment on larger pieces of kit that require checks. So, and then apart from the lift and stuff, there's provision and use of work equipment regs, which kind of takes in everything else. So that's all of the equipment that you use as a business should be safe to operate. How you prove it's safe to operate can vary. It's not just as black and white as the lifting operations, but it's being aware of all of that and making sure that you have the right documentation in place and you've read it. It's just some people get cert and go, great, I'm compliant, but don't actually read the results of that inspection. That's how you manage that. So yeah, it's like reading your waste transfer documentation.
Yep. So how many clients do you know that have maybe had the HSE or EA visit them? How many do you think? Because I think people assume, oh, they're not going to look at me because I'm a small company, or,
Yeah.
this is all I do. They're not going to come on site. But how many do you think
I would say a
that you
good
know of, obviously?
90% at the minute for health and safety in particular,
Really?
because, well, Northern Ireland have started, the health and safety executive have started these things called campaigns. And so they will try to visit a wide ranging number of businesses on those campaign topics. So they'll go in, they've just recently finished workplace transport. They're on now lockout and tag out.
Okay.
Before that, it was welding. And so where I live in particular, huge amount of welding. And I think pretty much every business, even if it was a small sort of 5-man band to the couple of hundred employee organisations, pretty much got a visit. And they're very helpful, but they also were quite strict with the requirement of what they were visiting on. So construction sites as well. That's been a fairly recent thing though. Environment agency, you're talking about 10% maybe of companies getting a visit. Really
see,
is that different.
the environmental agency, I'm only aware of sort of the waste companies that we certify being had the EA in them, to be honest. If you're
And that's
outside the
part of
waste remit, they don't look. But they should. There should be more funding for the EA, if you ask my opinion, to enable them to go in and prosecute.
Absolutely.
I see stuff all the time that, not from our clients, but, we're out and about all the time and we see stuff going on. It's bad.
Yeah, really bad. As I say, if they don't have 14,001, I would say probably 99% of businesses aren't aware of what their legal responsibility is around environmental legislation. As I said, it's quite a wake-up call for a lot of businesses when they go to implement the likes of 14,001, suddenly be aware of all of this that they didn't realise. It always gives you sort of a pause and cause for concern, and then you know that you're doing a good thing, actually, because you should be aware. And so 14,001, I think, is just a really good standard from that perspective.
Have you seen any organisations really benefit from having 14,001, for example?
Absolutely. I mean, if you really manage your waste effectively, that management should pay for itself or actually provide an income or savings as well. So, instead of throwing all into one skip and paying a fortune, because landfill fees are only going up and up and up, it's not going to change. And so the price of that one skip is going to increase year on year. But if you start to sort of look at segregating your waste streams, recycling it a little bit more, things aren't going to landfill, you don't have the landfill tax to pay, and suddenly you're sort of bringing back, when you're segregating your scrap metals and things like that, which actually have value for sale. You see that everything starts to click into place. You're more efficient, you're minimising your scrappage. 14,001, sort of some of your critical key performance indicators can be that minimisation of waste. And companies really start to look at their waste streams and go, well, how come we have so much scrap metal, or we have so much waste wood or packaging? That's costing us money to dispose of on the other side. So review it, bring it back in, minimise and mitigate, look at your efficiencies, and suddenly that look at from an environmental perspective at your waste streams has saved the business thousands of pounds. So all of that.
Fit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's worth going through the pain, I think, of identifying the legislation and, making sure you're compliant. I mean, we have to do the same thing. We don't get certified, but we obviously have to be aware of all the legislation that's not only applicable to us, but our clients. And it can be a mammoth task.
It's huge. And that's every geographical area that you operate in as a certification body. So, and all the industry. So we do, our legislation registers are hundreds of items on each of the environmental health and safety and information security comes into it as well. It's big changes in that. So no, it's a vast topic, and it's one that everybody sort of battles with. And how to know and recognise when the legislation changes, that you need to be aware of the amendment or not. It could be a full-time job if you really let it, but it's about streamlining the process.
Yeah, you're right. It's not just identifying it, it's keeping up to date with it, because things change, don't they?
Yeah.
Would you use the same method to keep up to date with finding it in the first place? Go back on those websites and things like that?
Yeah. So exactly it. So you just keep refreshing your knowledge and going back and checking on a sort of regular, I would do it pretty much monthly on those websites to keep my knowledge up and aware, just because we're in so many different industries, and we have to be aware when we're doing the audit of what the most up-to-date legislation is, so that we can check our clients are aware of it. And if they're not, make them aware of it through raising of opportunities for improvement or non-conformance to say your process is letting you down. You weren't aware of this. It's directly related to what you do as a business.
So how often should they sort of check it themselves?
I think very much comes down to the risk level of the business. As you say, a small office-based company won't need to be on checking every month, because for the few legislations that are directly relational, they'll sort of catch them in time with a 6-monthly or an annual check and update. Your larger construction or manufacturing or engineering businesses, or those organisations that supply a service to a client that sort of is based in legislative requirement, like your architects, your structural engineers, and those people who sort of part of what they do is providing to their clients the most up-to-date requirements, probably should be looking at least monthly to keep an eye on what's changing and what's updated.
It's quite a lot of work, isn't it?
Quite a lot of work, but when you have your sources kind of figured out, it's a 10-minute job probably. Or quite a few professional bodies that they're registered with will actually send them updates and emails on changes in legislations, like your building regs. A lot of the professional bodies will actually let the architectural practices know, because they're registered with them, and keep them up to speed. Journals, magazines, sort of everything to do with your trade and industry. There's quite a few sources out there.
I suppose all the effort's worth it, because then you can sleep well at night. As a business owner, one less thing to worry about, isn't it?
Absolutely. When we raise things related to legislative breaches, it's one that is probably one of the most valuable ones that we'll raise for a company, because what we're doing is mitigating their risk. Much better that we see it than something happens because it's not right, or an enforcement body comes in and sees it and suddenly it's something much more significant. That's one of the beauty of the standards, to kind of have that checks and measures. While we're not there to verify, as we said earlier, it is that if we see it, it's to the company's own benefit for their risk, that they do something about it. And that tends to be the response I get back.
Good. Okay, we're out of time. Is there anything you wanted to add, Paula?
No, I think we've pretty much covered it. But I would say that if anybody ever has any queries or questions, you have my email is pretty much available, and come and ask the question on, we aren't quite sure what we should do here or there. I'd be more than happy to help.
Details in the show notes. Everyone knows how to get hold of us generally.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks for your time, Paula. Appreciate that. Been very informative. And we'll catch you another time. Think of something else we could do.
Thank you.